It is demonstrated that race has no biological or genetic basis. Gross morphological features which traditionally has been defined as races, e.g. skin color, are determined by non-significant and superficial genetic alleles with no link to any characteristics such as intelligence, talent, athletic ability, etc. Race has been socially and legally constructed despite the lack of any scientific evidence for dividing humanity into racial baskets with any generalized genetic meaning. When people define and talk about a particular conception of race, they create a social reality through which social categorization is achieved. In this sense, races are said to be social constructs. These constructs develop within various legal, economic, and socio-political contexts, and may be the effect rather than the cause of major social situations. While race is understood to be a social construct by many, most scholars agree that race has real material effects in the lives of people through institutionalized practices of preference and discrimination. End quote. Dr. Harold Freeman, who has studied the issue of biology and race, had this to say: if you ask what percentage of your genes is reflected in your external appearance, the basis by which we talk about race, the answer seems to be in the range of 0.01%. This is a very, very minimal reflection of your genetic makeup. End quote. Okay, so human beings are genetically virtually identical, and virtually all the variation that does exist lies within populations, not between so-called races. Another thing you have to consider is that there are no sharp distinctions between populations. Every population shades imperceptibly into another. There are no clear-cut divisions between populations. How can race exist in any meaningful sense? There's a little bit of difference between populations. A little bit. So what? Race realists can't even seem to agree where to set the boundaries. I've seen them arguing about whether people should be categorized in these larger race groups, these social constructs that have existed for a long time now, or whether they should divide groups up into smaller units. So some race realists are saying there are only a few races, and some are saying there are perhaps hundreds or more. As a species, we first evolved on the East African savanna maybe around 150,000 years ago. We are a young species. We didn't even start migrating out to the rest of the world until about 60,000 years ago? Has there been enough time for deep divisions between human populations to develop? No. We're still one species. Yes, there's been some genetic drift, and there have been genetic mutations too. But the human species is remarkably homogeneous. And like I said before, virtually all the variation that does exist lies within populations, not between so-called races. Let me read you a little bit of a blog I read the other day on anthropology.net called The Conception of Race by Tasha Spawn. Quote, "It is human nature to categorize things to make our reality more palatable. Also, it is a coping mechanism for status. Something as simple as the color of one's skin can denote their position in a hierarchy and can save a conversation. One does not have to talk to someone to figure out their status if they can just look at them and know according to their skin color, hypothetically speaking." Now, I'm not saying we all do this, but realize that ingrained within each one of us is our culture that society has presented to us since birth. I believe no matter who you are looking at, you will make some sort of assumption or employ some sort of stereotype to that person. This may include race, but more importantly, hierarchy or status judgment. End quote. The person who wrote this blog goes on to say that the conception of race is truly in the eyes of the beholder. And she basically says that racial stereotypes and assumptions are used to create a social hierarchy that is visible or easily identifiable. That rings true with me. Definitely. Bottom line, biological race categorization still being used by some people today simply don't work. Biological differences don't line up along racial lines. Modern science and the statistical tools we use today have made this point very clear. Your average European is very similar to your average African, even if those similarities are wrapped in a different looking layer of skin. Ultimately, Homo sapiens, we are one people, and we're a very homogeneous species, as I said. We're all part of the same family. A very dysfunctional family, yes, but one big family nonetheless. Thanks for watching, folks, and I will see you next video. Peace.